The gavel hit the podium so hard that Elsie Ramsey felt the vibration travel up through the soles of her boots and straight into her chest, where her heart was already hammering against her ribs like a trapped animal. She stood at the front of the crowd gathered in the sun-baked square of Caldwell, Kansas, on that sweltering August morning in 1882, and she looked directly at the man who had come to destroy everything she had built with her own bleeding hands. Harlan Collier stood 6 feet 2 inches of solid, sun-bronzed certainty, his dark hat casting a shadow over eyes the color of storm clouds gathering on the plains. He had ridden into Caldwell 3 days ago with his legal papers, his lawyer from Wichita, and the kind of quiet, devastating confidence that came from a man who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. He was the largest cattle baron in Comanche County, the owner of the Broken Spur Ranch, and he had come to foreclose on the Ramsey homestead, 420 acres of the finest water-fed grazing land in southern Kansas, because a promissory note signed by Elsie's late husband, Thomas Ramsey, 18 months before his death had come due, and Elsie could not pay it, or so Harlan Collier believed. The auctioneer, a reedy man named Mr. Potts from the county land office, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. The crowd of Caldwell citizens pressed in around the square. There were ranchers and merchants, women in sun-bleached bonnets, children perched on fence posts, a pair of Cheyenne traders watching from the shadow of the livery. Everyone in Comanche County understood what was at stake. The Ramsey water rights fed half the small homesteads downstream. If Collier absorbed the land into the Broken Spur, those families lost their irrigation by summer's end. Harlan had not planned to attend the auction himself. He had sent his foreman, a thick-necked man named Deke Pruitt, to finalize the paperwork. But something had kept nagging at him in the 2 nights since he'd served the foreclosure notice personally, riding to the Ramsey homestead at dusk and finding Elsie standing on her porch with a surveyor's transit scope over one shoulder and a leather ledger under her arm, not weeping, not pleading, just watching him with those green eyes that seemed to be calculating something he could not identify. She had said only 4 words to him that evening: "You should come Saturday." He hadn't understood what she meant, but he'd come. Now the auctioneer read out the legal description of the Ramsey parcel, and Harlan felt the familiar satisfaction of a business transaction moving toward its inevitable conclusion. He had offered Elsie Ramsey a fair price, more than fair, in truth, 15% above assessed value. She had refused. He had explained the legal reality of the promissory note. She had listened without expression. He had assumed she simply had no options left and was in denial, the way grieving women sometimes were, unable to accept hard truths. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong he was. "Before we open bidding on the Ramsey parcel," Elsie said clearly, stepping forward into the space between the crowd and the podium, her voice carrying across the square with the authority of a woman who had spent 4 years shouting survey coordinates across open prairie. "I would like to submit a prior claim for auction on an adjacent property, as is my legal right under Kansas Territorial Statute, Section 41, Subsection 9, regarding disputed boundary surveys." Harlan's head came up sharply. His lawyer, a man named Aldous Crane, stiffened at his side. Mr. Potts blinked. "I'm Mrs. Ramsey. The order of business today is governed by Kansas law," Elsie said pleasantly. "Which I have here." She produced a folded document from her leather satchel and laid it on the podium in front of Mr. Potts with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment many times. "A certified survey, completed by a licensed land surveyor, myself, licensed by the state of Kansas in 1879, demonstrating that the eastern boundary of the Broken Spur Ranch, as currently recorded in the county deed book, encroaches upon the original Ramsey land grant by a distance of 63 acres. Those 63 acres include the eastern water access and the primary spring." She paused. "Under the statute I cited, disputed boundary land is subject to public auction at the time the discrepancy is formally presented. I am formally presenting it. Now. The silence that fell over Caldwell's main square was the kind that pressed against your ears. Harlan Collier felt something move through him that he had not experienced since he was 19 years old, and a horse had thrown him into a canyon wall, the pure, physical shock of being caught completely off guard. He turned to Aldous Crane. Crane's face had gone the color of old flour. "She can't," Crane began. "She already did," Harlan said quietly. And something in his voice was not anger but something else entirely, something that surprised him deeply, something that felt uncomfortably close to admiration. To understand how Elsie Ramsey had arrived at this moment, standing in the center of a Kansas town square in the summer of 1882, prepared to auction a piece of the most powerful cattle baron's own land back to the public before he could take hers, you had to go back 2 years. You had to go back to the morning of Thomas Ramsey's funeral, when Elsie had buried her husband of 6 years in the red Kansas earth, patted the soil down flat with her bare hands, and then walked back to the homestead alone to figure out how to survive. Thomas Ramsey had been a good man. He had been a genuinely good man, which was not a thing you could say about every settler who came west chasing the dream of free land and honest work. He had loved Elsie with uncomplicated devotion, had respected her education. She had studied land surveying through correspondence with the United States Geological Survey before their marriage, and had supported her when she'd applied for her surveyor's license from the Kansas Land Office in 1879, one of the first women in the state to receive one. He had bragged about her to every man in Comanche County, and the men had smiled the way men smiled when a husband was proud of something that made them slightly uncomfortable. Thomas had also been, despite all his goodness, a man who made financial decisions without fully consulting his wife. The promissory note he'd signed with the First Territorial Bank of Wichita, $1,200, borrowed to finance new fence line, and a cattle drive that had ended in catastrophe when half the herd died of Texas fever on the trail north, was something Elsie had discovered in his desk 3 weeks after his death. The note had been purchased from the bank's loan portfolio by Harlan Collier's holding company 8 months later, a routine practice among the large cattle interests of the era, acquiring distressed debts from smaller banks to consolidate land. Elsie had been furious, not at Thomas. She could not be angry at a man sleeping in the Kansas dirt, but at the mechanism of it, the way that debt moved through hands like a card in a shell game, until it landed in the possession of the man most positioned to enforce it. She had understood immediately what Collier intended. The Ramsey land sat like a keystone between the Broken Spur's northern and southern pastures. With it, Collier's ranch would be the largest single land holding in the county. Without it, he had a productive gap in his grazing that cost him in cattle management every single season. So Elsie had done what Elsie Ramsey always did when faced with an obstacle. She had worked. For 14 months, she had worked as a freelance land surveyor for the county, riding out alone across the prairie with her transit scope and her measuring chains, recording boundary lines and water access points for homesteaders who needed certified surveys for their deeds. She was meticulous and she was fast, and word had gotten around that Elsie Ramsey's surveys were as reliable as any man's and considerably cheaper. She had taken on contracts from the Kansas Pacific Railroad's land office, surveying right-of-way parcels for the expanding rail line. She had saved every dollar, but surveying was not what had given her the weapon she used in the square that August morning. That had come from something she had noticed during her very first survey contract in the spring of 1881, a job that took her along the eastern fence line of the Broken Spur Ranch. She had been hired by a small homesteader named Gus Hartley, who suspected his neighbor, meaning the Broken Spur, had shifted fence posts to absorb a slice of his grazing land. Elsie had run the survey with her usual precision, beginning at the original government survey markers set in 1867, when the land was first parceled, and she had found something that was not about Gus Hartley's property at all. The Broken Spur's eastern boundary, as recorded in the county deed book, did not match the original government survey. Someone, she could not know if it was Harlan Collier himself or a previous owner, had at some point moved the recorded boundary line 63 acres to the east, absorbing land that, according to the 1867 markers and the original federal land grant, belonged to the Ramsey parcel. The encroachment included a spring and its water rights, which the Broken Spur had been using without legal standing for years. Elsie had gone home that evening and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, staring at her survey notes, thinking about the nature of hidden secrets and buried wrongs, and the particular kind of trap that powerful men laid without even realizing they were doing it because they had never been made to account for anything. She had not used the information immediately. She had waited, verified it twice more over the following months, obtained a second opinion from a surveyor named Mr. Hutchins from Dodge City who confirmed her readings, and then she had filed her certified survey with the Kansas Land Office in Topeka, listed as a pending boundary dispute, without telling anyone in Caldwell. She had sat on it like a bird sitting on an egg, patient and still, waiting for exactly the right moment to let it hatch. The moment was the auction. Under Kansas statute, a formally presented boundary dispute on contested land required the county to pause any transactions involving adjacent parcels and resolve the dispute first. By presenting her survey at the moment of the auction, Elsie had not only stopped the foreclosure in its tracks, she had triggered the legal mechanism that could force the disputed 63 acres to public auction, at which point the buyer would be whoever bid highest, and the proceeds would be applied first to any debts of record involving the adjacent Ramsey land. In other words, she had maneuvered Harlan Collier into a position where his own encroached land might pay off her debt to him. It was, by any measure of the frontier legal landscape in 1882, a masterpiece. Harlan Collier stood in the square and felt the gavel come down on something other than the podium. It came down on everything he had assumed about Elsie Ramsey, about the nature of widows and grief, and the limits of what a woman surveying land in Kansas could actually threaten. He watched her speak to Mr. Potts with calm, precise legal language, watched the crowd shift, and murmur with the particular electric excitement of people watching something unexpected happen to a powerful man, and he felt something crack open somewhere in his chest that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Aldous Crane was already pulling at his sleeve, talking about filing an injunction, challenging the survey's certification, buying time. Harlan heard him the way you hear a fly in a quiet room, present but peripheral. His attention was entirely on Elsie Ramsey. She was 31 years old, he knew from the county records he'd reviewed, with dark red hair pinned up under a practical wide-brimmed hat, her face weathered to a warm honey gold from years of outdoor work, her eyes the color of new grass after spring rain. She was wearing a plain gray riding skirt and a white shirtwaist with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, because she had clearly ridden into town this morning with work in mind, not ceremony. She caught him staring. She looked at him directly, and what was in her expression was not triumph exactly, and it was not cruelty. It was something more complicated than either of those things. It was the look of a woman who had been underestimated so many times that she had stopped being angry about it and had simply learned to use it. Harlan Collier took off his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair, put it back on, and said to Aldous Crane, "Find out if the survey certification is legitimate." "I'd lay money it is," Crane said sourly. "So would I," Harlan said quietly. "That's the problem. The legal proceedings that followed were not quick." In the autumn of 1882, the County Land Office in Caldwell convened a formal boundary review that would take 6 weeks to resolve, during which time the foreclosure on the Ramsey land was suspended by court order. Elsie went back to her homestead and kept working. Harlan went back to the Broken Spur and did the same. though he found his mind returning to the square in Caldwell with an uncomfortable frequency that had nothing to do with legal strategy. He rode out to review the disputed eastern fence line himself on a Tuesday in September, 3 weeks after the auction, needing to see the ground with his own eyes. He was accompanied only by his foreman Deke Prout and a ranch hand named Cal, and he found Elsie Ramsey already there, kneeling in the dry grass with a surveyor's measuring chain stretched between 2 iron stakes, making notes in her ledger with the focused concentration of a woman who was unaware she was being watched. She was not unaware. She never was. "You're on the wrong side of the line, Mr. Collier," she said without looking up. "Which line?" he asked, reining his horse to a stop. "Your fence line. Which is why we're here." She stood, brushing red Kansas dust from her skirts, and looked up at him on horseback. The sun was behind her, and she had to shade her eyes with one hand. "You can come down if you like. I'll show you where the 1867 markers are. It might settle the question for you personally, even if it takes the land office another month to settle it officially." He dismounted. Deke Prout made a noise of disapproval somewhere behind him. Harlan ignored it and walked toward her across the dry grass, his boots crunching on the late summer earth, and she led him to a flat sandstone rock half buried in the ground with a chiseled X mark and a bearing notation that any surveyor could read. "There," she said, "original federal marker. Your deed puts your boundary here." She paced off roughly 60 yards east, which places you 63 acres inside the original Ramsey grant. The spring is another 40 yards past your current fence. He crouched down and looked at the marker. He ran his thumb across the chiseled X and thought about what he was looking at, a federal landmark from 1867, 15 years old, as legitimate as anything he'd ever seen, telling him something about his ranch that he had not known and that someone, somewhere along the chain of ownership, had either noticed and ignored or had deliberately obscured. "Who owned the broken spur before me?" Elsie asked, as if she'd heard his thought. "I bought it from a man named Carlyle in 1876, Harlan said slowly. He'd owned it since 1870. "Carlyle," Elsie repeated, making a small notation in her ledger. "He would have been here during the original survey period. He would have known where the lines were. You think he moved them deliberately?" "I think the markers didn't move themselves," she said. It was not an accusation directed at Harlan specifically, and something in her voice told him she knew the difference, that she was placing the blame accurately and not inflating it to punish him. He straightened and looked at her. The September wind came across the prairie and lifted a strand of dark red hair across her cheek, and she pushed it back with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything else. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her face more clearly than he had at the auction, the way her eyes moved over the landscape with constant, quiet assessment, the way she held her measuring chain with the unconscious ease of a tool she'd used 10,000 times. "Why didn't you use this sooner?" he asked. "You've known about the encroachment for over a year, based on when you filed with the land office." She was quiet for a moment, which surprised him because he'd expected her to have a ready answer for everything. "I wasn't sure I wanted to," she said finally. "I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do to trigger an auction on land that your ranch hands depend on. Men have families." She looked at the spring, glinting in the distance. "And then you came with the foreclosure papers, and I decided that sometimes you use the tools you have, or you lose everything. So I forced your hand." "You forced my hand," she agreed. There was a long silence between them that was not entirely uncomfortable, which confused Harlan considerably, because by rights it should have been the most hostile silence in Comanche County. "The debt," he said, "the $1,200. What about it? If the disputed land auctions for what it's worth, and it will, given the spring, the proceeds would more than cover it." He watched her face carefully. "You would come out clear." "I know. And you'd have the water access legally confirmed." "I know that too." He put his hat back on and studied her for another moment, this woman who had spent 2 years building a legal trap out of nothing but knowledge and patience and an absolute refusal to go quietly. "You're a hell of a surveyor, Mrs. Ramsey," he he said. It was not what he'd intended to say. It was what came out. Something shifted in her expression, brief and quickly controlled, but genuine. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. He rode back to the broken spur that afternoon with the Kansas sun at his back and his thoughts thoroughly, uncomfortably rearranged. He was 43 years old. He had built his ranch through 15 years of hard work and harder decisions, had buried 2 business partners and a younger brother, had run cattle from Texas to the Kansas rail heads through drought and blizzard and outlaw territory. He had been married once briefly to a woman named Catherine who had come west from Philadelphia and hated every minute of it, and had gone back east in 1875 with a quiet, mutual understanding that they had wanted different things. He had been content since then with the ranch, with work, with the kind of life that filled up every hour with tasks large and small, and left no room for the sort of wanting that made a man feel exposed. He had a feeling, riding home through the gold-lit prairie, that this contentment had a limited lifespan. The formal boundary hearing was held in the Caldwell courthouse in October, a 1-story building of sandstone and timber that served equally as the county seat's administrative hub and occasional Sunday meeting hall. Judge Amos Breck, a spare, dry-humored man of 60 with a deep respect for solid documentary evidence, presided. Elsie presented her certified survey, her chain of verification through Mr. Hutchins, and the photographic plates she had obtained of the original 1867 Federal Survey records from the Kansas State Archives in Topeka, a detail that made Aldous Crane visibly deflate when she produced them, because it removed any argument about record accuracy. Harlan's legal team challenged the certification process, then the chain of custody of the federal records, then the calibration of Elsie's measuring instruments. Elsie answered each challenge with the patient, detailed precision of a woman who had anticipated every one of them and prepared accordingly. When Crane suggested that a female surveyor's field measurements might be subject to greater error than those of a certified male professional, Judge Breck looked at him over his spectacles for a long moment and then asked Elsie to explain her verification methodology. She spoke for 45 minutes without notes. She described her transit scope, a Gurley surveyor's instrument manufactured in 1878, its calibration process, the triangulation method she'd used to cross-check her measurements against 3 fixed astronomical reference points, and the mathematical error margins at each stage, which were, as she explained clearly, within the acceptable federal standard of 4 inches per mile. She referenced her calculations by page number from her leather ledger, which she laid open before the judge. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "I have no further questions for Mrs. Ramsey," Judge Breck said, and the look he gave Aldous Crane was the look of a man communicating an opinion without employing language. Harlan Collier sat in the back of the courtroom and listened to all of it. He had dismissed Crane's plan to attack her professional credibility before the hearing began. It had struck him as both wrong and strategically stupid, given that it was likely to fail. But he had not fully understood the scale of her competence until he heard her explain it. The methodological precision of her work was extraordinary. She had not just found an encroachment. She had documented it in a way that was essentially unassailable by any legitimate legal standard. He left the courthouse before the session ended, which was unusual for him, because Harlan Collier was not a man who walked away from things. He walked out into the October afternoon, which was cool and blue and smelled of wood smoke from the town's chimneys, and he stood on the courthouse steps for a while thinking about the nature of secrets and the damage they did over time, spreading outward from wherever they were buried like cracks in river ice. He had not known about the boundary discrepancy. He was certain of that. He had bought the broken spur from Carlisle in good faith based on the deed as recorded, and the deed's error was something he had inherited rather than created. But that did not mean it was not his responsibility to correct. He had been benefiting from 63 acres of land and a spring that were not legally his. He had been watering cattle from that spring for 6 years. The fact that he hadn't known the wrong was being done did not mean the wrong hadn't been done. This was the kind of moral accounting that Harlan Collier found himself doing more frequently since Elsie Ramsey had stood in the town square and upended his certainties. Judge Breck's ruling came on a Thursday morning 2 weeks later. He found Elsie's survey legitimate and the boundary discrepancy confirmed. The 63 acres, including the spring and its water rights, were ordered returned to the Ramsey land grant effective immediately. The question of the auction, whether the disputed land would go to public sale, was rendered moot by an arrangement that Harlan Collier had, to the considerable surprise of Aldous Crane, proposed directly. He had written Elsie a letter. He had done it 3 days before the ruling, sitting at his desk in the Broken Spur's main house by lamplight, with 2 failed drafts crumpled in the corner, and a third that he had nearly crumpled as well but had finally sealed and sent with his ranch hand Cal, because the alternative was allowing a situation to continue that his conscience had firmly rejected. The letter offered a settlement. The 63 acres would be formally returned to the Ramsey deed without auction. In exchange, Harlan Collier's holding company would forgive the $1,200 promissory note in full, effective upon Elsie's signed acceptance of the land return. No money would change hands. No auction. No further legal proceedings. The practical logic was clear. The disputed acreage was worth far more than $1,200, so from a pure financial standpoint Harlan was absorbing a significant loss. But the spring's water rights, once legally confirmed as Ramsey property, would give Elsie control over a water access that the Broken Spur had been relying on, which meant a drawn-out auction fight would cause Harlan operational problems for years. The settlement was the clean solution. That was what he told himself. That was the practical framing. The other reason, the one he did not write in the letter and did not say aloud to anyone, was simpler and more inconvenient. He did not want Elsie Ramsey to lose her land. The thought of it, of those 420 acres passing to the Broken Spur through a debt that had been acquired as a tactical business maneuver, sat badly with him in a way that had grown worse with each passing week since the auction. She had built something real out there on her homestead. She had done it alone, with knowledge and stubbornness and a surveyor's transit scope. He did not want to be the man who took it from her. Elsie received the letter on a Wednesday evening. She read it twice at her kitchen table, then set it down and looked at her hands for a long time. She had been prepared for a fight. She had built herself up for it over months, the legal scaffolding of her strategy built precisely for extended battle. The settlement offer dismantled that scaffolding in 2 paragraphs. It gave her everything she needed, the land, the water rights, the debt cleared, and it asked nothing of her except acceptance. She did not trust it. That was her first reaction, and she recognized it as the trained skepticism of a woman who had been navigating a world built to disadvantage her, where straightforward offers from powerful men usually contained hidden costs. She read the letter a 3rd time, looking for the trap. She could not find one. She wrote back the following morning. Her acceptance was brief and formal, 3 sentences signed in her precise hand. But she added a 4th sentence at the bottom that was neither brief nor formal. It said, "I would like to understand why." His reply came 2 days later, a single page in a direct, unornamented hand that matched everything she had observed about him so far: no excess, no performance, no wasted words. Because it was the right thing to do. And because I found it impossible to remain comfortable after watching you demonstrate in a courthouse that you are considerably more capable than I had assumed. I had underestimated you. That was my error, not yours. Elsie sat with that letter for considerably longer than she'd sat with the settlement offer. The formal land transfer was completed in November 1882, with the weather turning cold and the Kansas prairie taking on the tawny, stripped quality of late autumn. Elsie rode into Caldwell to sign the final deed papers and came out of the county recorder's office into the thin winter sunlight to find Harlan Collier waiting by the hitching post, holding the reins of his horse and looking like a man who had stationed himself there on purpose. "I wanted to make sure it went through clean," he said. "It did," she said, tucking her copy of the deed into her satchel. "Thank you. Don't thank me. I was correcting an injustice I didn't know existed and restoring a debt I shouldn't have been holding." He paused. "Though I'll grant that the method by which you brought it to my attention was exceptional." She looked at him directly, the way she always did. That measuring look that he was starting to understand was not challenge, but simply how she engaged with anything with complete and undivided attention. "You could have fought it longer," she said. "Most men would have." "Most men haven't seen the size of your ledger," he said dryly. The sound she made was brief and surprised, half laugh, and it changed her face in a way that did something unexpected to his internal equilibrium. He had seen Elsie Ramsey focused and precise and quietly fierce, but he had not seen her off guard, and the momentary unself-consciousness of it struck him somewhere deep and quiet. "I have fence line repairs to get to before the ground freezes," she said, recovering herself. "Your eastern fence or the spring access?" "Both." She pulled on her riding gloves. "The eastern line needs new posts for about a quarter mile. I'll do it myself." "Yourself," he repeated. "I've set fence posts before, Mr. Collier. I know how to work." There was no defensiveness in it, just flat, factual statement. "I wasn't doubting it," he said, and he meant it. "I was going to offer help." She stopped pulling on her second glove. She looked at him with the expression of a person recalculating something. "Why?" "Because my fence posts caused the problem, and because I have 3 men with nothing pressing until the cattle drive in spring." He held her gaze steadily. "No strings, just fence posts." She thought about this. He could see her thinking about it, turning it over, testing for the hidden motive. And he understood the caution completely, because he'd read enough of the frontier's history to know what women like Elsie Ramsey had to navigate every day in a territory where land and labor and law were all weighted toward men. "All right," she said finally. "Monday morning. Bring your own wire." He felt something in his chest that was almost boyish in its brightness, which startled him considerably. The fence repair took 3 days, working through cold, clear November weather with the grass pale and the sky enormous and blue above the flat Kansas plain. Harlan brought 2 ranch hands, Pete and Will, and they worked alongside Elsie from sunup to midday, driving posts and stringing wire, while she walked the survey line ahead of them with her measuring chain to confirm the new fence followed the corrected boundary exactly. She was faster with the measuring chain than either ranch hand was with the post driver, and Will made the mistake of saying so in a tone that suggested surprise, and Elsie handed him the chain and said pleasantly, "Let's see." And Will spent 10 minutes thoroughly confused by the process while Harlan watched from a distance and did not bother concealing his amusement. In the afternoons, when the cold got serious, they would break for coffee at the Ramsey homestead, which was a compact, well-kept house of timber and stone with a kitchen garden laid over for winter, and a workshop attached to the side of the barn where Elsie kept her surveying equipment, and her drafting table, and a remarkable, painstakingly organized collection of land survey records going back to the original territorial surveys of the 1860s. Harlan found himself in the workshop on the second afternoon, looking at the maps. They were extraordinary hand-drafted, precise, annotated in Elsie's clean notation system, covering virtually the entire land area of Comanche County and parts of neighboring counties. She had been building a comprehensive picture of the region's land ownership for years, cross-referenced against the original federal surveys, and the result was the most accurate and detailed private land record he had ever seen. "You've mapped the whole county," he said. She was behind him, washing the coffee cups at the basin, and she came to the doorway of the workshop and looked at what he was looking at. "Most of it," she said. "There are gaps in the northeast corner where I haven't had contracts." You thought about selling this to the county. The land office's records are half out of date. Yours are." He searched for the word and could not improve on the obvious one better. "I've thought about it," she said carefully, and the county recorder offered me a third of what the work is worth. I declined." A pause. "There's also the matter of the Kansas Pacific's land department. They've been trying to hire me as a staff surveyor for the rail extension since June. I keep telling them I won't relocate." He turned from the maps to look at her. She was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed against the chill, watching him with that thoughtful expression. The late afternoon light was amber in the workshop and it caught the red in her hair. "Why won't you relocate?" he asked. "Because this is my land," she said simply, and there was something in the way she said it, not defiant, not aggressive, just deeply certain, that told him exactly how much the past 2 years had cost her and how much the outcome of November had meant. "Yes," he said, "it is." The fence line was completed on the third day, and Harlan's men rode back to the broken spur, while Harlan himself sat at Elsie's kitchen table drinking the last of the coffee, in no particular hurry to leave, which was unusual for him. He was a man who was always in a particular hurry to get to the next thing, always calculating forward toward the next task, the next season, the next decision. He had been this way since he was 22 and had first come west from Missouri with $200 and an absolute refusal to fail, and the habit of forward motion had served him well. It had also, he was dimly aware, prevented him from sitting still in pleasant circumstances for more than a few minutes at a time. He was on his third cup of coffee. Elsie was at the other end of the table making notations on a survey form for a contract job, the scratch of her pencil steady and quiet in the cold afternoon. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the prairie with its long, low sound. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something faintly herbal from the dried bundles hanging near the window. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up. "You can ask. Thomas, your husband." He paused, uncertain of the propriety of the question but committed to it. He didn't know about the boundary discrepancy. "No," she said. "He didn't do surveys. He wouldn't have known what to look for." "And you found it by accident, more or less, while doing Hartley's survey?" "Essentially." She set her pencil down. "I almost didn't flag it. I almost wrote it off as an instrument error on my first reading and moved on. But the numbers were too consistent. 3 separate readings, all putting the marker in the same place. When something keeps telling you the same thing, it's usually telling the truth." He thought about that. "You're a careful person," he said. "I have to be," she said. "In my profession, a careless measurement costs someone their land. I learned that early. In life generally, I mean, not just surveying." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was getting better at reading. The one that said she was deciding how much of herself to offer to a given conversation. "I've had reason to be," she said finally. "Women who aren't careful in this territory tend to end up at someone else's mercy." "You don't seem like a woman who ends up at anyone's mercy," he said. "That's because I work very hard not to," she said. And then, with a slight shift in her expression, something drier and wryer, "And sometimes I auction their land back first." He laughed. It came out with a completeness that surprised him, genuine and uncalculated, and she looked briefly startled, and then something genuinely warm moved across her face, quick as a flash of sunlight between clouds, before she looked back at her survey form. He rode home through the November dusk feeling like a man who had misplaced something important and was beginning to understand where it might be found. December came cold and bright to Comanche County, with the first serious snowfall on the 14th, a soft, thick fall that muffled the prairie into silence and turned the broken spurs fence lines into long white threads against the pale sky. Harlan occupied himself with the ranch's winter work equipment maintenance, feed inventory, correspondence with his cattle buyers in Kansas City, but he found himself engineering reasons to be in Caldwell on days when Elsie was there, which he knew from the county land office schedule meant Tuesdays, when she typically filed completed surveys. He was not subtle about this, which was unlike him. Subtlety was usually a tool he employed with considerable precision. But something about Elsie Ramsey made directness feel more natural, perhaps because she was herself so direct that artifice felt disrespectful. They began to fall into a habit. Tuesday afternoons in Caldwell, coffee at the counter of the Meredith Hotel's dining room, which was warm and smelled of pie, and had the virtue of being a completely respectable public location that required no explanation from either of them. They talked. They talked about land and law and the strange, contested history of the Kansas Territory, about the railroad's expansion and what it would do to the county's water usage, about the Cheyenne and Arapaho communities still moving through the southern plains, and the systematic dispossession that the reservation system was inflicting on them. A subject on which Elsie had sharply articulate views that surprised Harlan not in their content but in their detail. Because she had clearly listened to and observed the indigenous people she encountered in her surveying work with the same focused attention, she gave everything else. "The land we're both standing on has a longer history than any deed we've filed," she said one Tuesday in January, with the snow piled outside the hotel window and the warmth of the dining room surrounding them. "I think about that sometimes. All my careful surveys, all my measured boundary lines, they'd look fairly arbitrary to someone who was here before any of it." "Does that trouble you?" he asked. "It makes me try to do less harm," she said, "which I know isn't enough, but it's what I can do." He looked at her across the table and thought about all the ways a person could come to the same honest conclusion by genuinely different routes. He had been raised to believe that land was something you claimed and improved and defended, the fundamental transaction of the frontier. She had been trained to measure it with absolute precision, to understand its boundaries as human constructions laid on top of something that preceded and would outlast them. They were not so far apart, he thought, in what they valued, but they had arrived at their values differently, and the difference was interesting to him in a way that had nothing to do with arguing. "I want to show you something," he said, on a Tuesday in February when the weather had broken briefly and the roads were passable. "If you're willing to ride out." She had looked at him steadily. "Where?" "The Broken Spur's northern quarter. There's a canyon up there that I've never had officially surveyed. I've suspected for a while that the land office map of it is wrong." Her eyes sharpened. "How wrong?" "Come see." They rode out together on a Wednesday morning, which was the first time they had been on horseback together, and Harlan discovered that Elsie rode the way she did everything with quiet competence. No fuss, no performance. A blue roan mare she handled with light, confident hands. She had her transit scope wrapped in oilskin and packed in her saddlebag, which told him she'd already decided before they left that the investigation was serious. The canyon was in the Broken Spur's northern section, a limestone formation that cut down through the prairie in a dramatic fold, with a creek at the bottom running through carved white stone. The land office map showed it as a simple valley, undifferentiated from the surrounding terrain. The reality was considerably more complex. A canyon with multiple arms and a hidden upper section that contained, Harlan suspected, a second spring and a significant section of sheltered grazing land that was not included in the Broken Spur's assessed acreage. Elsie climbed down off her mare and looked at the canyon entrance with an expression of focused delight that Harlan had not seen before, the particular pleasure of a surveyor confronting an interesting problem. She had the transit scope out in under 2 minutes. "Give me the morning," she said. He stood back and watched her work. She moved through the canyon with methodical efficiency, recording bearings, measuring distances, building a picture of the formation with her instruments and her ledger. She climbed limestone outcroppings without hesitation, set her instrument on a narrow shelf of rock, and shot a bearing across 100 yards of clear winter air with the steadiness of a woman who had done it in worse conditions. She called occasional readings aloud to herself, not for his benefit, just the habit of working, the surveyor's verbal notation that matched measurement to memory. 2 hours into it, she found the upper spring. She heard it before she saw it, a thin sound of moving water above the canyon's dry season level, and she tracked it around a bend in the limestone to where it emerged from a crack in the canyon wall and ran down a moss-green shelf of rock into a small basin. "There," she said, and the word had the quiet satisfaction of a person who has confirmed what they suspected. Harlan came to stand beside her. The spring was modest but reliable-looking, clear water running over pale stone in the February light. "Is it on the ranch's current deed?" he asked. "I'd need to run the full coordinates, but based on the bearing from the canyon entrance," she was already flipping through her ledger, running a quick calculation, her pencil moving in the margin. "I think it's about 40 yards north of your current recorded northern boundary." He looked at her. "So it's not mine." "Not as recorded." She looked up from the ledger. "The land immediately north belongs to the Federal Grazing Reserve. You'd need to file for a homestead extension or purchase from the land office." A pause. "But the water access from the Canyon Creek is definitely within your boundaries, and that's the more valuable asset anyway." He was watching the spring. He was thinking about hidden things, about the ones you found by accident and the ones you built over years, about the way the ground always knew more than the deed said. "You don't have to tell me this," he said. "The spring's off my deed. You could have noted it and said nothing." "I could have," she agreed. "But I'm a surveyor. My job is to tell people what the ground actually says, not what's convenient." A slight pause. "Especially when the person in question is trying to do right by me." He turned from the spring and looked at her, and she was already looking at him with that direct, measuring expression, except that this time there was something additional in it, a softness around the edges that she was not bothering to conceal, and that made his chest do something complicated and immediate. "Elsie," he said. He had not used her first name before. It came out differently than he'd expected, quieter, more certain. She did not look away. "I think," he said carefully, "that I have been finding reasons to be in Caldwell on Tuesdays for long enough that my ranch hands have noticed and have very likely formed opinions." "Mine too," she said, and she said it with the dryness that was her version of warmth. "Mrs. Hartley, who lives 3 miles from the homestead, rode over last week to tell me that Harlan Collier was a solid man who had handled the settlement honorably, and that she was asking for a friend." He felt the laugh build and let it go. "And what did you tell Mrs. Hartley?" "I told her that I had no opinion on the subject," Elsie said, and her eyes were laughing too, bright green in the pale winter light of the canyon. "Which is the most dishonest thing I've said in years." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and he did not ask first because the moment made asking unnecessary. And he took her face in both hands, rough, work-calloused hands against her wind-chilled cheeks, and kissed her in the limestone canyon, with the February creek running beside them and the spring murmuring from the rock wall. And she kissed him back with a directness and a warmth that told him everything he needed to know about the past 3 months. When they separated, she had her hands around his wrists, and she looked at him with that steady, assessing gaze, and then she said, "I want to be honest with you. I don't make decisions quickly. And I have worked very hard to build a life that depends entirely on my own efforts. I will not give that up for anyone." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to." "Then you understand that whatever this is," she paused, choosing words with the care she gave her survey notations, "it has to be between 2 equal parties, not you absorbing me into the broken spur, not me losing my surveying practice or my deed or my independence." "Elsie," he said, "I bought a ranch because I wanted something of my own. I understand the feeling with more clarity than you might expect." He looked at her steadily. "I fell in love with a woman who outmaneuvered me legally in a town square in front of half the county. I think it's fairly clear I'm not threatened by competence." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face settled, not softening exactly, but resolving, the way a landscape looks after a storm has passed and the air becomes completely clear. "All right," she said. "That's honest." "You told me to tell you why," he said. "About the settlement." "I told you it was because it was the right thing to do." That was true. The other part I didn't tell you was that I had already, at that point, been thinking about you considerably more than was professionally appropriate." The sound she made was soft and surprised, and entirely unlike her usual composed self, and he held the memory of it carefully, the way you hold something you know you'll want to keep. They rode back to the Ramsey homestead in the February afternoon, side by side through the pale winter grass, and they talked the whole way with the easy, continuous flow of two people who had been saving up conversation for a long time. He stayed for supper, and she made a prairie stew with salt pork and dried beans and cornbread that was simple and very good, and they ate at the kitchen table by lamplight while the Kansas wind made its low, long sound outside, and it felt like something that had always been meant to happen and was only now catching up to itself. Spring came slowly to Comanche County in 1883, the warming arriving by degrees, crocuses first in the protected hollows, then the grass coming green along the creek banks, then the full, extravagant explosion of the plain spring that covered 400 acres at once in wildflowers and new growth. Elsie's fence line was straight and solid, her 63 recovered acres green with the spring's water, and her surveying contracts were expanding, because word had continued to spread about the quality of her work, and her role in the Caldwell boundary case had made her something of a legend in the county surveying community. She and Harlan had settled into a courtship that satisfied neither of them for being too cautious, and that they were both being cautious about because they were both, underneath their different kinds of confidence, people who had been hurt by things not working out, and who were consequently careful about what they invested hope in. It was Deke Pruitt who forced the issue, which was not something anyone could have predicted. Deke was Harlan's foreman, thick-necked, taciturn, and loyal to the broken spur with a kind of fierce, old-fashioned devotion that sometimes expressed itself unhelpfully. He had disliked Elsie's interference from the beginning, had been the voice urging legal challenges and prolonged resistance during the boundary dispute, and had watched the developing courtship with an expression of steady disapproval that he made no great effort to conceal. In April, Deke made the error of expressing this disapproval out loud, at the wrong moment, to the wrong person. He had come to the Ramsey homestead on a Wednesday with a message from Harlan, found Harlan himself already there, because Harlan had arrived an hour earlier without sending word, and found both of them in Elsie's workshop looking at the canyon survey notes. Deke stood in the workshop doorway with the expression of a man confronting confirmation of something he'd been dreading, and he said, to no one in particular but definitely to Harlan, "This is a mistake. A woman who'd trick a man the way she did in the square, she's not to be trusted in your personal affairs." The silence that followed was very complete. Harlan did not turn immediately from the map he was looking at. When he did, he was very calm, which was, as his ranch hands well knew, more alarming than anger. "Trick," he said. "You know what I mean," Deke said, digging in with the stubbornness of a man who had said something he couldn't take back. "She played you. She presented a legitimate legal survey of a genuine boundary discrepancy that revealed a wrong that had been done to her land," Harlan said, his voice even and clear. "If you call that a trick, I'm concerned about your understanding of the law and the plain truth. She knew what she was doing," Deke said. "She planned it." "Yes, she did," Harlan said. Over 14 months of work, while managing a 400-acre homestead alone and maintaining a surveying practice. It was exceptional. He paused. "I'd like you to hear yourself, Deke. You're objecting to a woman being intelligent and prepared." Elsie, for her part, had said nothing throughout this exchange. She was watching Deke Pruitt with the expression she used when she was gathering information before deciding what to do with it. She did not need Harlan to defend her, and Harlan knew she didn't, but she also did not stop him, because the defense was genuine and was being made on principle and not on her behalf alone. "I'm objecting to her being a risk to the broken spur," Deke said. "The broken spur's concerns are mine to manage," Harlan said, "and they are not the matter at issue." He was quiet for a moment. "Deke, you've been with this ranch 11 years and I respect that. But if I hear you speak about Elsie Ramsey without basic respect again, we're going to have a different kind of conversation." Deke left. He did not resign, because his loyalty to the Broken Spur was fundamentally stronger than his disapproval of any single situation. And within 2 months, he had arrived at a kind of wary neutrality toward Elsie that gradually, over the following year, would evolve into something approaching grudging respect after he watched her survey a disputed water rights case for a neighboring homesteader that saved 3 families access to irrigation. But that was later. After Deke had gone, Elsie looked at Harlan and said, "You didn't need to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to. I can handle Deke Prout." "Undoubtedly," he said. "But some things are worth saying in clear language regardless of who can handle what." She came across the workshop to him, which she had not done before, crossing the space between them without waiting for him to cross it, and she put both hands on his face the way he had done to her in the canyon. The gesture returned, and she kissed him with the full force of a woman who had been deciding for weeks whether she was going to do this and had decided. He asked her to marry him in May on a Tuesday, which was fitting. He did not make a production of it. He asked her over coffee at the Meredith Hotel, in the same 2 chairs they had occupied on every Tuesday for months, and he told her that he had been thinking about it since February, and that he wanted to be clear about what he was asking, which was not for her land or her practice or her independence, but for her company for the rest of his life, which he understood might require negotiation on various logistical points. She said yes. She said it without extended deliberation, which surprised and moved him, because he had expected her to think it over for a week in the careful way she approached everything. When he said so, she told him she had actually been thinking about it since March. They were married in June of 1883 in the Caldwell courthouse, Judge Breck presiding with a dry warmth that suggested he found the whole situation satisfying in ways that went beyond the merely ceremonial. It was a small gathering. Elsie's friend and neighbor Mrs. Hartley and her husband, a few of the Ramsey homestead's neighboring families, Harlan's ranch hands including a visibly moved Pete and a stoic but present Will. Deke Prout came, stood at the back, and at the end shook Harlan's hand and nodded to Elsie with an expression that was the closest he generally came to approval. The question of where to live was solved with the directness that characterized both of them. Elsie's homestead, with its repaired fence, its 63 recovered acres in spring, its workshop and survey office and 400 acres of good land, was a working property that required regular occupation and management. The Broken Spur, 6 miles north, was a larger operation that required Harlan's regular presence. They decided to maintain both, spending 4 days of each week at the homestead and 3 at the Broken Spur, a practical division that confounded their neighbors' expectations and suited them completely. The Ramsey homestead acquired a sign on the gate post that read Ramsey Collier, licensed surveying and cattle in Elsie's neat lettering, which caused a mild sensation in Caldwell the first time anyone noticed it, and which Harlan thought was perfect. In the summer of 1883, Elsie completed what would become her most consequential professional work, a comprehensive survey of the entire eastern section of Comanche County, cross-referenced against the original federal land grants of 1866 and 1867, and the subsequent homestead filings that identified 14 separate boundary discrepancies, 12 minor and 2 significant, that had accumulated over decades of imprecise recording. She presented the work to the Kansas State Land Office in Topeka in September with a proposal for systematic correction. The state surveyor general, a careful bureaucrat named Abernathy who was not in the habit of being surprised, spent 40 minutes reviewing her documentation and then offered her a consulting contract with the state land office that paid more than she had earned in the previous 2 years combined. She accepted. She negotiated the terms from her kitchen table with the contract laid out beside her coffee cup, made 3 changes to the standard clauses, and signed it with the same spare satisfaction she brought to everything. Harlan read the contract over her shoulder and said, "You changed the liability clause. The original put excessive risk on the consultant. It's now balanced." "Did you study law as well as surveying?" he asked. "I read," she said simply. He kissed the top of her head and went back to his end of the table and his cattle purchase figures and felt something that was simple and enormous at once. Gratitude, he thought. Gratitude for the particular luck of being a man who had come to foreclose on something, and had instead been educated, corrected, and irreversibly altered. That autumn, as the Kansas prairie went gold and the cattle drives wound down for the year, and the homesteads of Comanche County settled into winter preparation, Elsie told Harlan she was expecting their first child. She told him matter-of-factly at breakfast, the way she would have told him anything factual, and then looked at him with the particular expression that meant she was monitoring his reaction carefully, because she was more uncertain about something than she was showing. He had looked at her for a moment, and then he had put down his coffee cup and stood up from the table and come around to her and held her with the kind of quiet, complete attention he gave to things that mattered most, and said, "Good," into her hair. She laughed. "Good. Very good," he said. "Exceptionally good." He could feel her laughing against his chest, and he held on. The winter of 1883 to 1884 passed in the particular warmth of people who have found each other and know what they have. Elsie's practice continued through the winter indoor work, drafting and correspondence, and the state consulting contracts desk work. And she rode out for field surveys on the warmer days, as far into her pregnancy as the work allowed, which was farther than most people thought advisable, and which she managed without incident because she was careful and knew her limits precisely. The child was born in April 1884, a boy, delivered in the bedroom of the Ramsey homestead by Mrs. Hartley and the Caldwell physician Dr. Emmett, while Harlan sat in the kitchen and did something completely unlike himself, which was nothing. He sat and waited and listened to the sounds from the other room, and held his hat in his hands, and felt the particular terrifying tenderness of a man who has, for the first time in his life, something to lose that he cannot manage or plan for or outwork. When Dr. Emmett came to the kitchen doorway and said, "Healthy boy, Mrs. Collier is doing fine," Harlan had to sit still for another full minute before his legs were reliable enough to stand. The boy was named Thomas, for the simple, uncomplicated reason that Elsie wanted to honor the man who had loved her well, and had not meant to leave her with impossible problems. Harlan had agreed without hesitation, because it was right, and because he understood the distinction between grief that was finished and love that continued, and he had enough respect for both to honor them without confusion. Thomas Ramsey Collier grew up between 2 properties and 2 ways of working: the ranch's scale and physicality, the survey practices precision and intellect, and seemed from early in his childhood to be absorbing both in the particular way that children absorb things they are surrounded by constantly, not as lessons but as air. In 1885, the Kansas Pacific Railroad's Land Department, having failed to hire Elsie as staff, contracted her for the most significant single survey job of her career: the boundary and right-of-way survey for the extension of the rail line from Caldwell south to the Indian Territory border. It was a major undertaking that covered 40 miles of terrain and required 6 months of field work. She assembled a small survey team, 2 licensed assistants she had trained herself from among the local homesteaders' sons, and took on the contract with the focused, organized energy that characterized everything she did at scale. The railroad job changed her practice from solo work to a small but genuine operation with staff, contracts, and a reputation that extended well beyond Comanche County. The Kansas State Surveyor General mentioned her work in his 1886 annual report to the state legislature as an example of the quality of private surveying available in the territory, which was both accurate and, by the standards of 1886 Kansas, remarkable, given that she was one of fewer than a dozen licensed women surveyors in the state. Harlan read the legislature report. He read it carefully, beginning to end, and then he put it on the kitchen table and went and found Elsie in the workshop where she was drafting coordinates from a recent field survey. And he stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, this woman who had come into his life as an adversary and had become the person without whom the days made less sense. "The legislature report is on the table," he said. She looked up briefly. "I saw it. Your work is in it. I know. By name." "Harlan," she said, with the fond, dry patience she sometimes employed when he was being slightly slower than usual, "I know. I'm very proud of you," he said. "That's all." She looked at him with the expression that was entirely hers, warm and direct and lit from somewhere internal, and she said, "I know that too." She smiled. "Come look at what I found on the South Survey. There's a limestone formation near the territory border that I think hasn't been recorded at all. The federal maps have that whole section blank." He came into the workshop and looked at the draft, and she showed him where the blank space was, and they talked about it for 20 minutes with their heads bent over the drafting table and Thomas asleep in his crib in the next room. The April evening settling over the Kansas prairie outside, warm and green and full of the sound of the land, doing what the land had always done regardless of who measured it or what they argued about. Life on the homestead and the broken spur found a rhythm in the years that followed that was particular to them. Not the conventional rhythm of a cattle ranching family, not the itinerant rhythm of a surveyor's practice, but something made out of both, shifting and adjusting through the seasons with the same practical flexibility that had characterized both of them individually from the start. The Broken Spurs cattle operation grew. Harlan made 2 strategic purchases in 1886 and 1887 that expanded the ranch's grazing capacity and cattle breeding program, and he hired a young ranch manager named Frank Oates to handle more of the day-to-day operation, which gave him time to be present at the homestead more consistently. He learned to read survey maps during these years, not with Elsie's professional precision, but well enough to understand what she was working on and to be a useful second pair of eyes on complex boundary problems. She taught him the way she taught her survey assistants, directly and without condescension, expecting him to learn because she expected that of anyone she took the time to teach. Deke Prout retired in the spring of 1887, bought a small house in Caldwell, and came back every spring roundup to help because he found retirement disagreeable, which was what everyone had expected. At his retirement supper, he told Harlan the Broken Spur had been the best years of his life, and he told Elsie, with the labor of a man making an effort he'd put off longer than he should have, that he'd been wrong about her. Elsie thanked him with the composed directness that was her way, and then made sure his plate was kept full, which was her version of warmth in practical action, and Deke seemed to understand it correctly because he came back for Christmas supper that year and the year after as well. Their second child arrived in the summer of 1887, another boy, who was named James, no particular family obligation, just a name they both liked, and who turned out from the earliest age to be a different creature than Thomas, loud and bold and physical, where Thomas was quiet and observant, as if they had each been given different portions of both their parents' natures and had sorted them out in contrasting ways. James's first attempt at walking concluded with him falling headlong into the workshop drafting table, and Thomas, aged 3, and extremely serious about it, handing him solemnly back to standing, which Harlan thought was the most accurate preview of their entire sibling relationship he would ever witness. The spring and eastern fence line of the recovered 63 acres continued to serve, all these years on, as the most reliable water source on the Ramsey homestead, feeding the kitchen garden, the small herd of cattle Elsie maintained on her own account, and the survey equipment's wash basin. Every spring when the water ran clear and cold from the limestone shelf, Elsie would take a moment to think about the 1867 survey marker with its chiseled X, and the afternoon she had knelt in the dry grass, and realized the numbers were telling her the same thing 3 times in a row. The ground had been trying to tell her something. She had been careful enough to listen. The Kansas Pacific Rail line, when it reached completion in 1887, ran along a right-of-way that was documented in a survey so precise that its successor surveys, done 30 years later by different surveyors with different instruments, would confirm its accuracy to within the acceptable margin of error. The surveyors doing those later reviews would note the work's quality in their field logs. By then the name Elsie Ramsey Collier would be unknown to them, but the measurements would still be exactly right. In the autumn of 1888, the State Land Office proposed a new comprehensive survey of the Indian Territory border counties, a politically sensitive undertaking in which the accuracy of boundary lines had serious implications for both the remaining indigenous land claims and the expanding Anglo-American settlement. The state surveyor general invited Elsie to head the project team. She considered it for a week, which was longer than she usually took to decide anything, because the weight of what it meant, the consequences of accuracy or error at that particular boundary, was not something she took lightly. She talked about it with Harlan late one evening when both boys were asleep, and the house was quiet except for the Kansas night wind and the occasional sound of cattle settling in the near pasture. She did not ask him what she should do. She asked him to tell her what he thought about the larger question of surveyors' responsibility when their work intersected with territorial claims that had a human cost, not a theoretical question, but a practical one she was genuinely turning over. He thought about it for a while before answering, which was why she had asked him, because he thought before he spoke and took the question seriously. He said that he believed accuracy was the only thing a surveyor could offer that was genuinely useful. That inaccuracy didn't protect anyone. It just made the injustice harder to see, and that being the person who recorded the truth exactly was worth something even when the systems using the record were imperfect. She accepted the state contract in the morning. The border survey took 8 months of 1889, a year that was dense and difficult and produced work that she was deeply satisfied with professionally, and that weighed on her in the evenings, because the territory's history was present in the land in ways that her instruments could measure but not resolve. She came home to the Ramsey homestead that December thinner and quieter than usual, and Harlan met her at the gate with Thomas, now 5, on his shoulders and James, 2.5, holding his hand, and the lamplight from the kitchen window warm across the winter ground, and she stood there for a moment just looking at all of it before she dismounted. "Welcome home," Harlan said. She walked to him and held him for a long time without saying anything, which was unlike her, and he held on without asking anything, which was exactly right, and eventually she said, "I'm glad to be home," and her voice was quiet and certain. The years continued in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, because the prairie was not a forgiving landscape, and the cattle business had its cycles of drought and disease and market collapse, and the survey practice had its own complex negotiations and territorial disputes and professional challenges. But with the fundamental underlying certainty of 2 people who had found in each other something they had not known they were looking for. The broken spur weathered the drought of 1890 better than most ranches in the county, because Harlan had diversified the herd management, and because the Ramsey homestead spring, properly documented and legally secured, provided reliable water access that they shared with 3 neighboring homesteaders in the tradition of frontier mutual aid. Elsie organized the water-sharing arrangement with the same precise, documented care she brought to everything, and the written agreement she drafted for it was later cited by the County Water Board as a model for similar arrangements elsewhere. Thomas, at 6, began insisting on accompanying Elsie on local survey work when school was not in session, and she let him, because he had an instinctive aptitude for reading the land that she recognized as genuine. He would hold the measuring chain end with serious care and watch the transit scope with the focused attention of a child who understood, without being able to articulate it yet, that what was being done was precise and important. Harlan watched this and felt something that was both recognizable. He could see Elsie's qualities running clear as a creek through the boy's manner, and entirely its own, the particular feeling of watching a child who was finding their shape. James was, predictably, more interested in the horses. Elsie's practice, by the early 1890s, had become something that had no clear precedent in the county. A small, respected, professionally licensed surveying firm operated by a woman who was also a cattle homesteader's co-proprietor, who consulted for the state land office, who had trained 3 younger surveyors, 2 men and 1 woman, the latter being a young woman from Dodge City who had found Elsie through the state licensing board and had written her a letter asking for professional guidance, and who continued to ride out herself with her transit scope whenever the work required it. Harlan had expanded the Broken Spur to the point where Frank Oates' management was genuinely running the day-to-day operation, and Harlan's role had shifted toward longer-term planning, cattle breeding program development, and the increasingly complex process of navigating the legal and business landscape of a cattle industry that was being transformed by the railroad, the closing of the open range, and the arrival of barbed wire fencing that was changing the fundamental character of the plains. He found himself, in these years, doing something he had not done in his first decades of ranching, thinking about what the land would look like in 20 years, in 50, about the kind of agriculture and land use that would follow the cattle era, about what sustainable meant on the Kansas plains. Elsie had influenced this. Her surveyor's understanding of the land as a physical reality that preceded and would outlast any given use or claim had seeped into his thinking in the way that a long-time companion's perspective does gradually, invisibly, until you realize one day that your view of something fundamental has shifted, and you can trace the change to a conversation that seemed minor at the time. They talked about everything still. They always had. The kitchen table at the Ramsey homestead was the site of more discussion, argument, planning, professional problem-solving, and quiet companionship than any other square footage in Comanche County, and there was rarely an evening that did not include some version of it. Harlan at his end with the ranch ledgers or the cattle buyer correspondence, Elsie at her end with the survey drafts or state contract documents, the boys doing their schoolwork in between them or in later years. Not in between them because they had grown enough to need their own space. The lamp turned up bright against the prairie darkness, the wind outside doing what the Kansas wind always did, moving across the flat. Land with the patience of something that will still be doing it long after all the fences and deed lines and carefully chiseled survey markers are gone. In the summer of 1894, Elsie's training protege from Dodge City, a young woman named Clara Marsh, received her Kansas surveying license, the first woman to do so since Elsie herself 15 years earlier. There was a small celebration at the Ramsey homestead pie, good coffee, the satisfaction of a lineage of hard work acknowledged and continued. Clara had brought her fiancé, a schoolteacher from Wichita named Henry, and they sat around the table talking about the survey business and the state of Kansas land law in the 1890s and what was coming next, and Elsie looked at Clara's capable, confident face and thought about herself at 29, standing in the survey office in Topeka receiving her license, certain of her work and uncertain of almost everything else. "The next case that goes sideways on you," Elsie said to Clara, "you write to me before you do anything else. The law in this territory is still being made, and it helps to have someone who knows which precedents to cite." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I wrote to you in the first place." Thomas, 10 years old that summer, sat at the end of the table listening to all of this with the serious, absorbing attention that was his primary characteristic, and at the end of the evening he said to Elsie, while she was washing the supper dishes, "Mama, did you always know you wanted to survey land?" She thought about it honestly. "I always knew I wanted to know exactly where things were," she said. "Surveying was the way that turned out to be useful." "I think I want to know where things are too," Thomas said. She looked at him, this boy with Harlan's dark eyes and her red-brown hair, and a quality of steady attention that belonged to neither of them specifically, that was simply his own, and said, "Then pay attention to what the ground tells you." He nodded seriously, as if this were practical instruction, which it was. Harlan came in from the workshop where he'd been looking at something in the survey records. He developed the habit of reviewing Elsie's older work in the evenings, learning the county's land history from the inside out, and found Thomas helping Elsie finish the dishes with the settled comfort of a child who was exactly where he was supposed to be. And Harlan stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment in the lamplit summer evening and thought about the August morning in 1882 when he had ridden into Caldwell with foreclosure papers and the absolute certainty that the outcome was decided. Nothing about what had happened since was what he'd intended. The debt had been forgiven. The land had been returned. The woman he'd come to dispossess had instead taken him apart with a certified survey and a legal statute, had rebuilt him into something better than he'd been before, and had, in the process, built something with him that was larger and more solid than anything he had managed to construct alone. He thought that a man who could not recognize when he'd been corrected was a particular kind of fool, and that the luckiest thing that had ever happened to him was being corrected by Elsie Ramsey in front of half of Comanche County on a hot August morning, gavel coming down on his certainties like a verdict. "You're in the doorway again," Elsie said, without looking up from the dish she was drying. "You do that when you're thinking." "I'm thinking," he said. "I know." She put the dish away and turned around to look at him with those green eyes that still did something to his equilibrium in the same way they had in the canyon in February of 1883, that first February of what had turned out to be a long, complex, deeply satisfying series of Februaries. "Come sit down." He came and sat. James, somewhere in the house, was making the noise that 8-year-old boys made in the evenings when they were supposed to be preparing for bed, and had no intention of it yet. Thomas had settled at the table with a surveying pamphlet he'd acquired somewhere. The lamp was warm on the table. Outside, the Kansas evening was settling toward night with the blue and gold that the plains did at dusk, the kind of sky that was too big to look at all at once, that required you to take it in pieces. "I was thinking about the gavel," Harlan said. Elsie looked at him. "In the square. August 1882. The sound it made when Potts brought it down." He paused. "I thought it was going to be the end of something. Your homestead, the last of your options." He looked at her steadily. "It turned out to be the beginning of everything." Elsie was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much of something to say. Then she said, "I knew there was a possibility it would work. I wasn't certain." A pause. "I was afraid, actually. I was more afraid that morning than I've ever been, including during the court hearing and including the border survey and including Thomas being born." She said it plainly, offering it as information. "I just didn't show it." "You didn't show anything except absolute certainty," he said. "That's the only way to walk into that kind of room," she said. "If you show the fear, they've already won." She tilted her head slightly. "You looked at me in the square right after I put the survey down. Do you remember what your face was doing?" "I have no idea." "You looked," she searched for the word, "thrown, like a horse had gone sideways under you," a small smile. "It was the first moment I thought you might be someone worth knowing." "Because I looked thrown." "Because you didn't look angry," she said. "Most men would have looked angry. You looked genuinely surprised. Like a person who was actually thinking about what I'd done rather than just reacting to it." She met his eyes. "That's rare." He reached across the table and took her hand, which was warm and slightly rough, with the permanent slight callus along the right palm from the measuring chain, and she turned it to hold his back in the easy, habitual way of two people who had been holding on for years, and had no intention of stopping. Thomas looked up from his surveying pamphlet and regarded them with the calm, analytical expression of a 10-year-old who found his parents broadly acceptable. James could be heard preparing for bed with the efficient noise of a child finally in motion. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the enormous Kansas sky. The lamp burned on the kitchen table. The spring ran quietly over the limestone shelf, 60 yards east of the fence line, exactly where Elsie's survey said it was, exactly where it had always been. The land was what it was measured and marked and documented and disputed and recovered and lived on, and it held the homestead and the workshop and the table and the lamp, and the people gathered around it with the same vast, patient indifference that it held everything, which was not cruelty but simple fact, the fact that made all the measuring and the marking and the building necessary and meaningful. Elsie Ramsey Collier, who had once stood in a Kansas town square with a certified survey in her hand and stopped a powerful man's plans cold, who had recovered her land and her water rights, and forgiven a debt through nothing but knowledge and patience and the willingness to use both, who had built a surveying practice and a partnership, and a family out of the same material she brought to all her work: precision, care, an absolute refusal to accept any answer that did not match what the evidence actually said, looked across the lamplit kitchen table at the man who had come to foreclose on her dream, and had instead, through the particular alchemy of his own willingness to be corrected, become the thing she had not known she was building toward. And Harlan Collier, who had come to Caldwell in August 1882 with legal papers and certainty, and had left with neither, who had learned over the following years what it meant to be genuinely matched, not managed or complemented or accommodated, but matched, measure for measure, mind for mind, looked back at her across the same table with the same complete and uncomplicated love he had been carrying for more than a decade, a love that had started, if he was honest, in the exact moment she had placed a certified survey on a podium in front of him and shown him, in the clearest possible terms, that the land always knows where it is. The gavel had come down on a Tuesday. Everything after that had been the beginning.